The blizzard hit Frostpeak Haven like the sky had a personal grudge against the town. Chloe pressed her back against the heavy steel door of the Sugarcoat Café and shoved it open with her hip, dragging a pair of stuffed garbage bags into the alley behind the building. The wind screamed down the narrow passage between the brick walls and hit her like a fist, sending her honey-blonde hair whipping across her face and stealing every bit of warmth she'd built up during the last 6 hours of baking. She was wearing her work clothes, dark-fitted jeans tucked into ankle boots, a cream thermal that clung to every curve under her open flannel, and a flour-dusted apron she kept forgetting to take off. Not exactly blizzard gear. She heaved the bags into the dumpster, slapped her hands together against the cold, and turned back toward the door. That was when she saw him. He was massive. That was the first thing her brain registered. The sheer scale of the man slumped against the alley wall, knees bent, one enormous shoulder pressed into the brick like he'd been trying to hold the building up and simply run out of strength. He was in a dark jacket that was nowhere near thick enough for this weather, his head bowed, dark hair plastered against his forehead with snow and ice. No hat, no gloves. His hands, resting on his knees, were the size of dinner plates and had gone a terrifying shade of pale gray from the cold. Chloe stood very still for approximately 2 full seconds. Then, she walked straight toward him. "Hey!" She crouched down in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face, even with him sitting on the ground. The face she found there stopped her short. He was devastating, even half-frozen and scowling. A jaw like carved granite, a straight nose, heavy brows drawn together in an expression of pure, thunderous displeasure. Dark eyes opened and fixed on her with the kind of flat, unreadable intensity that most people reserved for things they were considering crushing underfoot. He looked like danger wearing a human suit. He also looked like he had about 40 minutes before hypothermia became a genuine medical emergency. "Can you walk?" she asked. He stared at her. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. "Right." Chloe straightened up, grabbed his arm with both hands, and pulled. He didn't move, which was roughly what she expected given that he probably outweighed her by 150 pounds of pure muscle. But he also didn't resist, and after a long, silent moment where he seemed to be making some internal calculation, he got his feet under him and stood. He rose to his full height, and Chloe took an involuntary step back just from the sheer vertical expanse of him. He had to be 6.5 feet tall. His shoulders were broad enough to block the wind coming down the alley. "Inside," she said, and pointed at the door like he might need the visual aid. His eyes narrowed. His scowl deepened, which she genuinely had not thought was possible. "I'm not asking you to marry me," she said. "I'm asking you to come inside before you die in my alley, which would be very bad for my Yelp reviews. Move." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but close to it. He moved. The back kitchen was warm and smelled like cinnamon, brown sugar, and the faint char of the bread she'd slightly overbaked at 11 that morning. Chloe pulled a stool out from beneath the prep counter and pointed at it. The man sat. The stool groaned. He peeled off his jacket, and she noticed, with the detached practicality of someone who'd grown up the daughter of a field medic, that his hands had started shaking. She grabbed the thick wool blanket she kept in the supply closet for the nights she worked so late it made more sense to just sleep on the break room couch. She crossed back to him and held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Take the blanket," Chloe said pleasantly. He took the blanket. She moved to the stove and put a pot of milk on, pulling the good cocoa down from the shelf, the real stuff, not the powder packets, and started working. Behind her she could feel him watching. It was not a comfortable feeling exactly. It was the feeling of being observed by something that operated on a different set of rules than she was used to. But it wasn't threatening. Or rather, she sensed somewhere in the back of her mind that it could be threatening, that this man contained a certain capacity for it, the way a cliff face contained the capacity for a fall. And yet, for reasons she couldn't have explained, she was not afraid. She set the mug in front of him. Dark, rich cocoa, a little cream, a cinnamon stick across the rim. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he wrapped both enormous hands around the mug and drank. The tension in his shoulders eased, barely, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. Chloe leaned against the opposite counter, crossed her arms, and gave him the space to exist without being interrogated. "I'm Chloe," she said. "This is my bakery. You're welcome to stay until the worst of the storm passes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so low it seemed to come from somewhere beneath ordinary sound, he said, "Valerian. Nice to meet you, Valerian." She handed him a plate with 2 thick slices of the good walnut bread, slathered with butter. "Eat." He ate. She watched him take the first bite and felt something odd. A warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's temperature. A pull she couldn't name, like recognition without memory. She chalked it up to exhaustion and went back to wiping down her prep surfaces. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was what was happening on the other side of that silence. From the moment she'd crouched down in front of him in the alley, fearless and bossy and smelling like cinnamon and something deeper, something that hit the back of his skull like a lightning strike, Valerian had known. He'd spent 32 years being the most powerful man on the continent. He'd fought wars, ended dynasties, sat on a throne that lesser men built their entire lives trying to reach. He had never, in all of that, felt anything like the scent that had hit him when she leaned close. His fated mate. Here. In a bakery alley, in the middle of a blizzard, in a small human town, where he'd come to disappear. He'd masked his aura so thoroughly that even strong shifters would walk past him without a flicker of recognition. He'd let himself look like a drifter, unshaven, exhausted, stripped of the 1,000 invisible signals of rank and power that usually moved through a room ahead of him like a bow wave. All of it deliberate, all of it necessary, after the council betrayal, after 3 attempts on his life in 4 months. He needed to vanish long enough to figure out who had turned against him. He had not planned for this. He sat on her stool, in her warm kitchen, eating her bread and drinking the best hot cocoa he had tasted in his life, and he looked at the curve of her back as she worked, at the casual grace of her hands, at the way she'd told a half-frozen stranger to move and meant it without cruelty. And he thought, with a clarity that cut through every political calculation in his brain, absolutely not. He was not dragging this woman into the wreckage of his court. He was not putting her in the crosshairs of people who'd tried to kill him. He was going to sit here quietly, recover, and leave. That was the plan. In the morning, he was still there, standing at the back door before she unlocked it, the blanket folded with military precision on the stool, his expression as forbidding as the weather outside. "You're going to let me work," he said. It was not a question. Chloe looked at him. She looked at the sky, which had eased from screaming white to a sullen silver. She looked back at him. "Do you know anything about baking?" A pause that might have been, in a different man, embarrassment. "I can learn." "Minimum wage," she said. "Free," he said. "Consider it payment for the blanket." She studied him for a long moment with those clear, perceptive eyes, and he had the unsettling experience of feeling genuinely evaluated. Most people, when they looked at him, were navigating fear or ambition. She was just looking. "Fine," she said. "Don't break anything." He broke 2 mugs before 9 in the morning. She handed him the larger ones without comment. By noon he had mastered the mechanical repetition of bread dough kneading with such focused intensity that she'd caught 2 of her morning regulars openly staring at his arms through the service window. He'd ignored them with the practiced blankness of someone accustomed to being watched. She'd bitten down a smile and gone back to her pastry case. At 2:15, the door opened and 3 men walked in who were not there for coffee. Chloe recognized them. The town knew them. They came around every few months, smooth and unhurried, and they left with an envelope. The man in front was broad-shouldered and wore his confidence like a weapon, and he settled his elbows on her counter and smiled the kind of smile that knew it had leverage. "Chloe, rough winter." He glanced around the café. Businesses really struggle in weather like this. Be a shame if something made things worse. I've already told you twice, she said, her voice steady. I'm not paying. His smile didn't move. I think you should reconsider. The kitchen door opened. Valerian stepped through it. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was holding a tray of cooling rolls, which under any other circumstances might have been almost domestic. But when he set the tray down on the counter and looked across the room at the three men, every particle of careful concealment he'd wrapped himself in over the past 2 months seemed to thin, just slightly. Not enough to reveal what he was, but enough to let through the faintest edge of what lived underneath. The part of him that had ended negotiations with a look. The part that rooms full of generals went quiet for. He reached up and pulled off his flannel, setting it aside, leaving only the thermal underneath, which did absolutely nothing to hide the architecture beneath it. He was built like something that had been designed for a specific and serious purpose, and the purpose was not baking bread. He looked at the three men. He did not speak. He simply let them see what had just entered the equation. The silence lasted 5 seconds. The man at the counter took his elbows off the surface. The smile was gone. We, the man started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. The sidewalk out front is getting bad. We should probably shovel that. We should, said one of the men behind him, already backing toward the door. Sorry for the trouble, said the third. The door closed. Through the front window, Chloe watched, with her arms folded and her eyebrows at her hairline, as the three men retrieved shovels from a truck parked outside and began, with great energy and apparent sincerity, clearing the snow from her front walk. She turned and looked at Valerian. He had already picked up the flannel and was putting it back on, expression unchanged, as if nothing of particular note had occurred. Do you want me to start on the cinnamon rolls? He asked. Chloe stared at him for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. The recipe's on the board. She went back to her work. But as she stood at the pastry case with her back to him, the smile she'd been holding finally got away from her, wide and bright and completely involuntary, aimed at no one. Outside, the snow was being shoveled. Inside, the giant, grumpy stranger was reading her cinnamon roll recipe with the focused gravity of a man reviewing a military campaign. And Chloe felt, for the first time in a long time, like the struggling little bakery at the edge of Frostpeak Haven might be exactly where something important was beginning. By Thursday, the line at Sugarcoat Café stretched out the door and down the front steps into the cold. Chloe had served the same core group of regulars for 2 years. Mrs. Aberl, with her chamomile and her crossword, the early shift guys from the lumber yard, a rotating parade of college students from the satellite campus 2 miles north who treated her corner booth like a library annex. She knew their orders. She knew their names. She knew which ones would tip and which ones would linger, and which ones, God help her, would ask for oat milk. None of them had ever brought friends before. Now they did. Now they brought friends and coworkers and, in at least 2 documented cases, people they had clearly pulled off the street on the walk over, because the word had gotten out. It had started as a whisper and escalated with the speed particular to small towns in winter, when there is nothing to do and nowhere to go, and a truly extraordinary piece of gossip is basically currency. The whisper was this. There was a man in Chloe's kitchen, and he was, by every available account, absolutely unreal. She overheard 3 separate variations of the description in a single morning. Tall as a doorframe. Built like a statue someone had decided to animate out of stubbornness. Had a face that would make you walk into traffic. Had a look on that face that suggested he was aware of this and deeply uninterested in it. The lumberyard guys had started coming in twice a day and ordering things they didn't want just to position themselves near the service window. 2 women who'd never been in the cafe before came in, ordered nothing, leaned on the counter for 12 minutes watching Valerian move through the kitchen with the focused economy of someone who considered wasted motion a personal failing, and then left a $20 tip. Chloe watched all of this with a bright, delighted smile she absolutely did not let him see. Because the thing about Valerian, and she was piecing this together slowly, the way you piece together a puzzle when someone keeps hiding the corner pieces, was that he was competent to a degree that bordered on unsettling. He'd spent the first morning studying her recipe board with the focused stillness of a man memorizing troop positions, and by the second afternoon, he was producing croissants with a lamination that made her want to sit down. He had the hands for it, which should not have worked given the scale of them, but he worked dough with the same precise control he seemed to apply to everything, and the results were infuriatingly good. She'd tasted one, told him so with genuine honesty, and watched something happen in his face. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The ghost of a thing that had not been used in a long time and wasn't entirely sure of its welcome. She'd made a private note of that and filed it away. The apron had been a practical decision. She was almost completely certain. She had 2 aprons available for staff use. One was a standard canvas number in dark navy, which fit her fine and would have fit most people. The other was a gift from her college roommate, made of thick pink cotton, printed with the face of a cartoon bear wearing a chef's hat, and sized for a person who was not 6'5" and built like an architectural decision. She had forgotten it was in the cabinet. She had absolutely not forgotten it was in the cabinet. She held it out to him on Friday morning with a face of perfect innocence. He looked at it the way a man might look at something he had been handed as a test of character. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not blink. He took the apron. Getting it over his head required a structural negotiation that she catalogued in detail for future private enjoyment. It sat across his shoulders like a flag planted on a mountain. The cartoon bear's face landed squarely in the center of his chest and stared out at the kitchen with an expression of cheerful bliss that contrasted with the expression on the face above it in a way that made the universe feel briefly, perfectly funny. He turned to the oven. He planted his feet. He gave the oven a look of flat, murderous assessment, the look of a man who has decided that an appliance is going to cooperate or answer for it. The soufflés came out perfect. She ate one standing at the prep counter and made a sound of involuntary satisfaction, and when she looked up, he was watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with soufflés, and everything to do with something she wasn't entirely ready to name. She looked back at her plate. The back of her neck felt warm. This was the other thing. The thing that was harder to file away. The kitchen was not a large space. It was functional and well-organized and stocked with everything she needed, and it had always felt like enough room when she'd worked it alone. With Valerian in it, the dimensions seemed to have fundamentally changed. Not in a crowding way. In a gravitational way. She was always aware of exactly where he was, the way you're aware of a fire in a fireplace. Not threatened by it, but orienting toward it without deciding to. When they reached past each other at the prep station, there were 2 or 3 seconds where the ordinary air between 2 people became something charged and specific. And they both felt it. And they both decided, with great mutual determination, to find something to look at on the other side of the room. He washed the dishes with the precise, contained energy of a man who could not permit himself to be idle. He reorganized her storage shelves once, without being asked, in a way that was objectively more logical than her original system, and she told him so, and he said nothing. But the ghost smile came back briefly, and she felt it like a small, warm thing in the center of her chest. The café was profitable for the first time since October. She didn't tell him that. She recounted the day's till on Wednesday night, and the number made her exhale very slowly into the empty kitchen and press her hands flat on the counter and just breathe for a moment. The way you breathe when you've been holding something heavy for a long time and someone has unexpectedly helped you set it down. The night she fell asleep over the inventory was not particularly special in its beginning. She'd sent her part-time counterstaff home at 6, locked the front door at 7, and settled at the back counter with her ledger and her laptop and a mug of chamomile she stopped drinking somewhere around 8:30. Valerian was doing the end-of-day cleaning, moving through the kitchen with the methodical quiet she'd come to recognize as his natural state. Water running, the soft scrape of a pan being stacked. She was 3 months behind on categorizing supplier invoices, and she was determined to close the gap. She did not close the gap. What she did was fold her arms on the counter, rest her cheek on her forearm for what was meant to be 30 seconds, and go under like a stone dropped in a deep, still lake. She didn't feel him notice, didn't feel the cleaning sounds stop, didn't feel the stillness that settled over the kitchen as he stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, his expression doing something complex and quiet that no one was awake to see. She did feel, distantly, the sensation of being lifted, not jolted, not fumbled, but lifted with the kind of careful precision that suggested he'd done the physics in advance and left no margin for error. She made a small sound and turned her face into the warmth of his shoulder without fully surfacing, the way you seek heat in sleep without understanding why. He carried her up the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the café where she lived. The apartment was modest and warm, stuffed with the small evidence of a full and genuine life. Books stacked in a way that suggested they'd actually been read, a quilt on the couch that had been washed so many times it had gone soft as fog, photographs on the windowsill, a single mug of pencils on the kitchen table beside a sketchbook she hadn't mentioned and he hadn't asked about. He noticed all of it in the few seconds it took to carry her to the bedroom. He noticed the way she had made a home out of a space above a struggling bakery in the middle of nowhere, with warmth and stubbornness and no apparent need for anything more. And something in his chest did what it had been trying to do since the alley, which was crack open at the seam. He pulled the quilt over her. She sighed and settled into the pillow. He stayed longer than he needed to, which he registered, and which he refused to examine. The cold had come back hard outside. He could hear it in the wind against the glass. He sat on the floor beside the bed with his back against the wall, and he didn't leave, and he told himself it was because it was cold and she hadn't put the heat on high enough and someone should be here in case the old radiator gave out. He told himself that for approximately 10 minutes. Then he stopped telling himself anything and just stayed. It was in that quiet, in the thin hours past midnight with Frostpeak Haven buried under snow and the café silent and Chloe asleep a few feet away, that he felt it. It was not a sound. It was not a sight. It was the particular vibration in the back of his skull that came from the deliberate, trained suppression of a shifter aura, the specific frequency of someone trying to move without being sensed. He'd been feeling this sensation for 32 years, and it had never once been nothing. They were outside the town perimeter, 2 of them, maybe 3, moving slowly, doing it carefully. Not close enough yet to have found him, but not far enough to be coincidence. The Obsidian Spire had long arms, and patience that came from centuries of having it always eventually pay off. He sat very still and let his own awareness expand outward, not allowing any of it to surface into something detectable, staying beneath the threshold, reading the shape of the threat. These were scouts, not soldiers. They were mapping the territory, checking for traces of a masked aura, looking for the subtle wrongness of a king hiding in plain sight. If they were scouts, the people who'd sent them were somewhere else, waiting for a report, not yet mobilized. He had a window. Small, but real. He looked at Chloe asleep under her quilt. Her face in the cold dark of the room was entirely peaceful, entirely undefended, entirely unaware that the storm outside was not the most dangerous thing that had found Frostpeak Haven this winter. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, rebuilt the walls around his aura with the precise and practiced care of a man who had stayed alive this long entirely on discipline, and made sure that nothing, not a particle, not a whisper, leaked out. The scouts would find an empty frequency and move on. He would deal with the rest before it became something that could touch her. He opened his eyes. Chloe sighed in her sleep and pulled the quilt tighter, and in spite of everything, in spite of the political machinery grinding toward this small, warm town, In spite of the weight of everything he had left behind and everything he hadn't yet solved, he felt his mouth do the thing it had been resisting since the first morning in the kitchen. It felt strange on his face, unfamiliar and irreversible, the way a door feels when you've walked through it and it has closed behind you. He let it stay, in the dark, where no one could see, just for a moment. Then he straightened his back, fixed his expression, and prepared to be a very large, very grumpy man kneading bread dough at 5 a.m. There was a cafe to open, and something was coming. And Chloe was not going to face it alone, even if she never knew he'd made that decision. Sitting on her bedroom floor in the dark, in a small town at the edge of the world, the night everything changed. The morning had been good. That was the thing Chloe kept coming back to, later, when she was trying to arrange the sequence of events into something her brain could process. The morning had been genuinely, unremarkably good. She'd had the radio on low, the kind of old acoustic stuff she played before the cafe opened because she could sing along without performing it for anyone. The ovens were at temperature. The front display case was already half filled with the almond croissants that had become, over the past 2 weeks, the most requested item on the menu, largely because Valerian made them and word had continued to spread in the specific, unstoppable way of small-town word. He was at the prep counter now, icing a tray of cupcakes she'd baked in the early dark before he'd come downstairs. Pale yellow cake, cream cheese frosting and soft peaks, a sprinkle of candied lemon zest on top. She was proud of them. They were the best batch she'd made in months, and she'd told him so, and he'd looked at the tray with the expression he used for things he was considering acknowledging, which was the closest he came to agreement. She was at the register, counting the morning's float, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, the low background register of a presence that had somehow become part of the room's architecture in 2 weeks. She was aware of him, and she was singing very quietly under her breath to the radio, and she was, without fully examining the fact of it, happy. The sound of engines came first. Not one. Several, all at once, in the deliberate unison of something coordinated. She looked up at the front window and saw the black sedans rolling down the street. 4 of them, large and armored in the way that things are armored when they are meant to communicate that they don't need to apologize for anything. They stopped in a formation around the front of the cafe. The doors opened. The men who got out were dressed in dark clothing that was clearly expensive and clearly meant to signal that fact. Close-cut coats with stiff shoulders, shoes that were not appropriate for snow, the studied carelessness of people who expected the world to arrange itself around their comfort. They moved with the assurance of men who walked into rooms and watched the rooms recalibrate. There were 8 of them that she could see, maybe more still in the vehicles. 2 were clearly in charge. One of them had silver hair swept back from a sharp face and the particular brand of handsomeness that comes wrapped in cruelty. The other was broader, younger, with the expression of someone who had been told he was important so consistently that it had become load-bearing. They came through her front door like they owned it. The silver-haired one looked at the cafe, looked at the wooden tables, the mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu board, the little vase of dried flowers on the counter, and let his gaze move across all of it with the slow deliberation of a person cataloging things that are beneath them. Quaint, he said, to no one in particular. Chloe set down the register drawer. We're not open yet. Can I help you? He looked at her then, and the look was the kind that happens before an answer arrives. An assessment, cold and thorough, like she'd been filed under a relevant category. He smiled in a way that had no warmth operating inside it. I'm not here for the pastries. He moved further into the cafe, his men following, spreading out around the room with the practiced ease of people accustomed to occupying spaces that didn't want them. I'm here for whoever's been hiding in this unfortunate little town, wearing a commoner's face. You know him as your kitchen staff, I believe. I don't know what you're talking about. That's fine, he said, conversationally. You don't need to. He turned and nodded at the younger man, who turned and nodded at two of the guards who moved toward the service window, and one of them, cutting across the front of the display case, caught the edge of the cupcake tray with a careless forearm and sent it off the counter. The tray hit the floor. The cupcakes, the whole morning batch, every pale yellow cake and cream-frosted peak, the careful sprinkle of lemon zest, hit the tile in a scatter of ruined color. White frosting in a smear across the floor. The radio kept playing. Chloe's mouth opened. Two of the guards were already moving around the counter toward her, and the silver-haired man was watching this with his arms clasped behind his back, and the expression of someone observing an administrative task being completed on their behalf. One guard reached across the counter and closed a hand around Chloe's wrist. She pulled back hard. His grip tightened. "You'll want to be calm," the silver-haired man said. "You're just insurance. This will be brief." From the kitchen, silence. Then the sound of something being set down. The specific, deliberate sound of a tray placed on a counter by someone who is no longer thinking about the tray. The kitchen door opened. Valerian stood in the frame. He was still wearing the flour-dusted thermal. He was still wearing the pink bear apron. His eyes moved from the guard's hand on Chloe's wrist to the scattered cupcakes on the floor, and he was still for long enough that the silver-haired man drew breath to speak. Valerian looked at the cupcakes. Something in the room changed. It was subtle. The way the quality of silence changes before a storm. Not louder, but denser. Weighted with incoming pressure. Chloe felt the guard's grip on her wrist falter slightly and tighten again in overcompensation. Felt the man beside her shift his weight backward an inch, without seeming to decide to. Valerian's eyes came up from the floor to the silver-haired man. The scowl was gone. What replaced it was harder to name. Not anger, not threat in any expression she had a word for. It was closer to the total absence of performance. Every human thing that masks what something truly is. Stripped away, all at once, completely. He reached up. He untied the apron strings from behind his back. He lifted the strap over his head. He folded the pink cotton with its cheerful cartoon bear into a careful, deliberate square and set it on the prep shelf just inside the kitchen door, like he was putting it somewhere safe to be retrieved later. Then he stepped through into the café. He rolled his right shoulder first, then his left. Not a stretch. Not a warm-up. The movement of a man removing something that had been sitting over him like a garment. Not the apron, something older, something internal. Setting it aside with the same calm with which he'd just set down the pink cotton. He straightened to his full height, and the room seemed to take a breath around him, recalibrate its sense of scale. The silver-haired man's smile stayed in place, but the eyes behind it narrowed. He was reading the shift and adjusting his calculation. She could see him doing it. He had the instincts of a predator, and the instincts were telling him something his pride was not yet willing to process. "You've made a long trip," Valerian said. His voice was completely different. Not louder, but it had dropped into a register that did something to the air in the room. It didn't echo, it landed, like weight on a floor. "I'd tell you to sit down, but you won't be here long enough to need to." "Don't flatter," the silver-haired man started. Then the aura came. It was not visible. It was not sound. It was not anything that Chloe had a framework for. No reference point. Nothing in her life or education or understanding of how the world worked that could have prepared her for the wave of pure, absolute pressure that rolled outward from the man standing in her cafe like a force of nature that had been wearing a flannel shirt for 2 weeks. It hit the room like a change in gravity. Not painful, not violent, but inexorable. The kind of pressure that doesn't ask whether you'd like to cooperate. It asked nothing at all. It simply was, and your body responded to it the way it responds to the edge of a cliff. Every guard in the room went to their knees. Not stumbled, not flinched. Went. cleanly and entirely, as if their legs had received a directive from somewhere more fundamental than their own volition. The silver-haired man lasted a half-second longer than the others, his pride staging a last futile resistance. And then he went down like the rest of them, one knee on her floor, and then both, his expensive coat pooling around him, his composure shattered in a way that made it clear it had been a construction all along, and not a foundation. The floorboards groaned. She felt it in her feet. The faint, deep vibration of something enormous pressing down through the building from every direction at once. Outside, she heard car doors opening, heard the distinct sound of more men stepping out of the vehicles, and then, without explanation, heard them stop. Silence. The silver-haired man's face had gone ashen. He was staring at Valerian from his knees with the expression of a man who has walked through a door in full confidence and found, on the other side of it, a drop of infinite depth. His mouth worked once. Valerian crossed the café in 5 steps. He didn't walk around the kneeling men. He walked between them, and each one pressed back and away from him instinctively, making space, the way all things make space for the thing at the center of a hierarchy when it finally stops pretending to be something else. He reached Chloe. The guard holding her wrist released it and crumpled to the floor and did not appear to be considering anything except the floor. Valerian's hand came up and closed around hers. Her wrist, where the guard's fingers had been, warm and certain and precise, and he drew her against him in one motion, one arm coming across her back, pulling her into his chest with a gentleness that was in absolute, dizzying contrast to everything else in the room. She looked up at him. Up a long way. His face was looking at the silver-haired man kneeling at his feet, and the expression on it was so far from anything she'd seen on the face of the man who glared at her oven and broke her mugs that she felt momentarily untethered from the last 2 weeks, as if she needed to recalibrate which version of him had been the disguise. Both, she thought distantly. Neither. Valerian looked down at the silver-haired man the way a mountain might look at something happening at its base. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, soft even. The softness of something that doesn't need volume because everything in the room is already attending completely. "Who," he said, "gave you permission to touch my queen's floor?" The words landed in the silence and stayed there. The silver-haired man stared up at him, and the color did not come back to his face. He opened his mouth and nothing came out, and he tried again, and what emerged was not speech, but the shredded remains of speech. Your Majesty, we were told that that the situation was—" "You were told," Valerian said, with perfect calm, "by someone who made an extremely consequential error in judgment, and you compounded it by coming here and putting your hands on her. In her café, on a Thursday morning." He paused. Before she opened, one of the other guards made a sound that might have been a sob. Nobody moved. Chloe was standing in the circle of Valerian's arm, pressed against the solid warmth of his chest, with her heart doing something loud and irregular, and her brain doing its level best to catch up to the current situation. She looked at the men on the floor. She looked at the man holding her. She thought about the alley. She thought about the pink apron. She thought about the careful way he'd folded it and set it on the shelf. And the thing that struck her, absurdly, standing in the wrecked remains of her Thursday morning, was that of all the things she'd understood about him to be real, the competence, the quietness, the ghost smile, the sitting on her bedroom floor in the dark, all of it was still him. All of it was still true. The crown underneath had not made any of the rest of it a lie. She tilted her head up and looked at his profile, at the sharp jaw and the focused eyes, at the face that was currently being, by any measurable standard, absolutely terrifying, and she said what came to her, which was, "Those were my best cupcakes." He looked down at her. For a fraction of a second, something moved in his expression. Startled, warm, and then arrested, the way you'd arrest anything in front of an audience. "I know," he said. He held her eyes for a moment, and the look in his was not that of a supreme alpha king doing a thing for political effect. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, without planning to, set it down in front of someone. He looked back at the silver-haired man. "Get up," Valerian said. "Pick up every piece of what you knocked over. Then go back to the Obsidian Spire and tell whoever sent you that the king has been found, that he is well, and that the next delegation that comes to this town without an invitation will not be having a conversation with me." He paused, and something passed through his eyes like a weather system. Cold, total, ancient. "Am I clear?" "Yes," said the silver-haired man, barely audible. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good." He released a breath. "There's a mop in the back." The men cleaned her floor. She stood next to Valerian and watched them do it, his arm still around her, the radio still playing its quiet old music in the background, flower dust still hanging in the morning light. Outside, through the front window, she could see the guards who'd stepped out of the vehicles, standing in the snow, not moving, waiting, no one quite certain what to do next. When the floor was clean, they filed out. The door closed. The sedans left in the same deliberate formation they'd arrived in, though considerably more quietly. The café was empty. The morning light was the same. The radio played on. Chloe looked at the empty display case where the cupcakes had been. She looked at the pink apron, still neatly folded on its shelf through the service window. She looked up at Valerian. He was already looking at her, with the expression of a man who has something enormous to explain and no good place to start. She said, "King." He said nothing, which was confirmation. She said, "The whole time." Still nothing. She took a slow breath in through her nose. She looked at the window. She looked back at him. When she spoke, her voice was steady, even, and entirely her own. "You're going to need to make more cupcakes," she said, "and then you're going to tell me absolutely everything." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I am." The Obsidian Spire was everything Frostpeak Haven was not. Chloe stood at the entrance of the great hall and let herself feel the scale of it. The ceilings that soared to heights that made the air feel different up there. The walls of dark polished stone veined with silver. The chandeliers that held more light than her entire bakery had ever contained. The floors were the deep black marble, of the kind that reflected everything above it like still water, so that the room seemed to have a mirror beneath it, doubling every candle and every silk gown and every carefully arranged face. It smelled like expensive things and old power, and the particular tension of a room that had heard a great deal of history and would never speak of it. She was wearing a gown. She had opinions about this. It was deep midnight blue, cut from something so fine it moved like water when she walked, fitted through the body with a precision that suggested whoever had made it understood their craft at a molecular level. Her hair was up. She had a necklace on that she refused to think too hard about in terms of its probable value. She looked, by every available measure, like she belonged here. She did not feel like she belonged here. But that was fine. She had never felt like she belonged in a kitchen before the first time she'd run one, and that had sorted itself out. Valerian was beside her, which helped. He was wearing a dark coat with silver at the collar that was the first clothing she'd seen him in, that seemed to have been made specifically to contain him, and the effect was significant enough that she had made the private decision not to look at him directly for more than 3 seconds at a stretch until she had more practice. He moved through the room differently here. He was always precise, always contained. But here the precision had an edge to it, a weight that the room acknowledged before he even spoke. Heads turning, conversations pausing, the particular silence that a space makes when the thing it was built around has returned to the center of it. He kept his hand at the small of her back and said, very quietly, close to her ear, "They're going to test you." "I know," she said. "You don't have to." "Valerian," she looked at him sideways. "I ran a struggling bakery in a town where it snowed 9 months of the year. I have been tested. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to understand was his version of undone. And then his jaw set, and he faced forward and said nothing more, which was its own kind of answer. The first one came within 20 minutes. She was standing at the edge of a cluster of women who had clearly assessed her on arrival and formed a coalition around a shared conclusion. They were beautiful in the way of people who have had every possible advantage in the cultivation of beauty, draped in colors that cost more than her monthly rent. And they smiled at her with the smiles of people who have had considerable practice deploying warmth as a weapon. "How charming," said the woman in ivory, tall, dark-haired, with the bone structure of someone whose family had been selecting for it for generations. "You must find all of this quite overwhelming. Coming from somewhere so—" She tilted her head. "Remote." "It's a lot," Chloe agreed pleasantly. "Though honestly, it looks much more impressive on the outside. In here, it's mostly marble and cold drafts. We had better insulation in Frostpeak Haven." A pause. A recalibration. "Well," the woman continued, the smile thinning at the edges, "I suppose there's a certain novelty in the king choosing someone so unpolished. One imagines he finds it refreshing. The way one occasionally finds simple food comforting before returning to a proper table." Chloe tilted her head. Her voice stayed warm, conversational, entirely without heat. "That's interesting. Because the man I know has spent the past 2 weeks producing croissants that made a grown woman leave a $20 tip in a small-town café and tear up in the parking lot. I've watched him study a recipe with the focus most people give to matters of life and death. So, when you say simple food, you mean the food that made him choose to stay? The food that made him wake up early and stay up late and be, for the first time in what I suspect has been a very long time, genuinely at rest?" She smiled. "Because if that's what simple means, I'll take it." The woman in ivory opened her mouth. Nothing came. "Also," Chloe added, as a friendly afterthought, "the insulation comment stands. You really should have someone look at the east corridor. There's a draft coming through that could cause significant structural issues over the winter." She turned away, and as she did, she caught Valerian across the room. He was standing with 2 men who appeared to be waiting for his attention, but he was looking at her. She knew that look. It was the kitchen counter look, the one she'd first seen over a mug of hot cocoa, the one he had when he'd stopped trying not to feel the thing he felt. It was not a public look. It had no business being on his face in a room full of aristocrats, and she suspected he knew that, and she suspected he didn't particularly care. She gave him the smile she reserved for moments that deserved it. He turned back to his conversation, but the line of his shoulders had changed. The next 2 came together, and they were more direct, and Chloe handled them with the same unhurried efficiency with which she handled a morning rush. Quick, accurate, no wasted motion. By the 3rd, the cluster had thinned. By the 4th approach, a lord in pewter gray who made a comment about the appropriateness of a baker sitting at the royal table, she simply said, calmly and in front of the people around him, "You're right that I'm a baker. I think you're suggesting that means I haven't earned my place here. But I'm curious, what is it that you've made, specifically, that earned yours? Because I can name what I made. Croissants, mostly. Also, a cinnamon roll that made the supreme alpha king of this continent stop scowling for the first time in what I understand was several months." "What did you make?" The lord went very quiet. Beside her, she heard a small sound from Valerian that she was 90% certain was the closest he'd ever come to laughing out loud in a formal setting. He dismantled the titles before the evening was over. Not publicly, not with theater, with the same quiet, absolute efficiency he brought to everything. He spoke to the chamber council at the end of the formal session, in front of the full assembly, his voice the low, settled register that made rooms attend, and he named what had been done. The betrayals, the corruption, the council members who had sent men with black sedans and contemptuous smiles to a small-town bakery to use a woman as leverage against their own king. He named the lord in pewter gray. He named two of the ladies. He stripped the titles with the air of a man correcting an administrative error. Bloodlessly, without malice, the way you remove a splinter. Precisely, finally, and with the clear intention of making sure the wound heals clean. The chamber was very still for a long time afterward. Then Valerian extended his hand to Chloe, who took it, and he led her out of the hall, and the room they left behind them was already beginning the slow, necessary work of understanding that something had changed. Not just at the top of the hierarchy, but in the nature of the top itself. The corrupted council was dismantled over the following weeks in a process that was systematic and complete, and which Chloe mostly observed from a respectful distance, watching the man she knew move through the machinery of his power with the same focused, unhurried precision he'd applied to her recipe board. He was good at this. She had suspected that, had felt it in the 2 weeks before the sedans arrived. The particular quality of someone who is capable of enormous things and has chosen, for reasons of their own, to apply that capability to something small and warm and real. She understood the choice differently now. She understood it from the inside. There were long days. There were late nights. There were more than a few moments where she sat in the vast, opulent quiet of the Obsidian Spire and missed the radio and the flour dust and the particular warmth of a small kitchen running at full capacity. She told him this because she had never been the kind of person who didn't say the things she meant, and he had listened with his full attention, the way he always listened, like every word was relevant. And the next morning she had found the royal kitchen fully stocked with every ingredient she'd used at the Sugarcoat Café, organized on the shelves in the precise logical system he'd instituted in her supply closet, and he was already there, at the counter, in the pink apron. It had made the crossing from Frostpeak Haven in its own bag. She had not asked him to bring it. He had simply understood that some things don't get left behind. She stood in the doorway of the largest, most well-equipped kitchen she had ever seen in her life. 6 ovens, 2 marble islands the size of most rooms she'd lived in. Every implement and tool arranged with the precision of someone who had thought hard about the relationship between function and flow. And she looked at the supreme alpha king of the continent, 6'5" of the most feared man in the known world of their kind, wearing a pink cotton apron with a cartoon bear on the chest, whisking heavy cream in a copper bowl with the focused intensity he brought to everything he decided to do. He looked up. He looked at her in the doorway. "The cream is for the millefeuille," he said. "The dough finished resting 20 minutes ago." She crossed the kitchen, took the whisk from his hand, checked the cream's consistency, handed it back, and kissed him. Not the careful, considered version of anything. The real version. The version that had been building since an alley in a blizzard and a mug of cocoa and every moment of charged silence across a kitchen counter. He kissed her back with one arm coming around her waist and the copper bowl held very carefully out to one side, which was very him. And she smiled against his mouth, which was very her. When they separated, he looked down at her with the expression that was his alone, the one she had first seen as the ghost smile, the one that had grown through 2 weeks of small mornings into something unguarded and permanent and entirely unself-conscious, the expression of a man who has stopped maintaining the distance between what he is and what he feels. "The cream," she said. "The cream," he agreed, and went back to whisking. She pulled her own apron from the hook, the plain canvas one, dark navy, nothing on it, and tied it behind her and took her place at the marble island beside him, and the royal kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of 2 people who know how to work together in a small space, even when the space is enormous. This is what nobody tells you about power, she thought, pressing the dough flat with her hands, feeling the good resistance of it, the living quality that dough has when it's right. They tell you about the weight of it, the cost, the loneliness of the altitude. They tell you about the view from the throne and the burden of the crown. What they don't tell you is that the most powerful thing in the world is not the aura that drops a room to its knees, not the voice that makes chambers go still, not the name that opens every door. The most powerful thing in the world is the warm kitchen, the familiar routine, the person beside you who looked at a half-frozen stranger in an alley and chose, without calculation or agenda, simply to bring him inside. True royalty is not the crown you wear or the fear you command. It is not the marble halls or the ancient name or the unbreakable authority of bloodline and title. It is the lengths you will go to protect the warmth of the one who saved you from the cold. It is the pink apron, folded carefully on its shelf before the world ends and put back on when the world is set right again. It is the blizzard you walked into and the light you found on the other side of it, and the understanding that you will spend the rest of your life making sure that light has everything it needs to stay on. Valerian paused in his whisking. He looked at her in profile, the concentration on her face, the capable, unhurried movement of her hands, the flower already on her forearm. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the bedroom floor in the dark, in the small town, in the middle of everything falling apart, when he had understood that some decisions are made not in courts or councils, but in quiet rooms, alone, when the only witness is the cold outside and the warmth inside, and the person sleeping 3 feet away who has no idea what she has already changed. He went back to the cream. The kitchen was warm. The city outside was vast and old and full of power. Inside, it smelled like butter and sugar and the beginning of something that was going to last. If you enjoyed this romance audiobook, please like and subscribe for more epic stories. There are plenty more Grumpy Kings and Sunshine heroines where that came from, and every single one of them is waiting for you right here.